Hi, I'm here with Thomas Nail, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Denver and author of recently published book, Theory of the Image. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you.
I must admit, I was really looking forward to our discussion. When preparing to our conversation, I did my research online and I was taken by how well you're received by your students. Your students describe you as very knowledgeable and approachable.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, that's nice.
Which is great. I mean, your openness is something I experienced myself. So thank you for the opportunity of doing this podcast together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure.
And to explain to our listeners, what we're trying to do here is to possibly bridge the gap between abstract thinking and acting, between thought and execution, by an exchange between you as a philosopher and me as a digital toolmaker on a topic of digital image. My goal for today is to hear your point of view on the future and possibilities that technology gradually unlocks. Now, I'm aware that the digital image is only a short chapter of your recent publication, but I believe that limited scope of our discussion is enough to inspire our listeners. So after all, we're all users of digital devices, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So to begin, describe to us, if you will, your way of working. What is new realism and what is your method of approaching problems?
I think if I had to sum up sort of one of the main findings of the book that sort of guides the whole project, is that the image we often think about as a sort of mental representation, something that is in our brains. We see the world and then we sort of conjure up something we call an image that happens inside of our minds, which is a copy or a resemblance of the world outside. And I think that that's not right. I think that there's definitely something going on there, but I think that's a very narrow way of thinking about what an image is. An image is not. I mean, that is a real thing. There is something that happens in our eyes and in our brains, that is related to the external world, but that is the tip of an enormous iceberg. That's the part that we see, if you will, of the surface of the iceberg. Below the surface of the water is this enormous process of the rest of the world, of all of these material processes which we don't actually see, which are part of the fabric of the world, the air, the environment, the trees, all of the forms of media that we use. All of this is going on, and it's very active. It's not what we have in our brains is not a copy of the world. It is the world itself, just by other means, if that makes sense. It's a continuation of the world by other means inside of us. It's not a question of resemblance, but it's a kind of question of interactivity, of performativity. We are interacting with the world when we see, although we often experience, especially vision, as a passive thing that sort of happens to us. It's actually very active, both in our bodies, the way we move, in our eyes, the way they kind of seek out, and we don't see that. We don't see the way that their eyes move and follow and respond to the world. So that's to say that one of the main takeaways was for me to think about that much larger context of what an image is also what the world does. Whether there are humans there or not, there are images, as they sort of engage with each other in the same ways that we interact with the world interacts with itself. And that interaction is what produces an image. And I know that that's a very broad definition of the image, but the shift is from thinking about images as representations to thinking about images as processes that have their own habits, their own cycles. They sort of iterate and respond to each other, and they produce these kind of meta-stable states, like an eddy in a world, like a whirlpool or an eddy in a river or something like that, where they're clearly flowing and they're moving, but they're also stabilized relatively so that they look very static. Like if you look at an object, a chair, a table, a book, or whatever, it looks like it's just sitting there, but it's not. And even if you weren't looking at it, the image is still there because the image is real and it's material. Whatever we think about that, we're part of it when we view it.
So the way as you describe it in the book, that the image is a process by which matter twists, folds, bends, and reflects itself into sensations and affections. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what was the inspiration to arrive at such viewpoint on the image itself?
It's an old inspiration, actually. It goes back to the Roman poet Lucretius, who wrote, we only have one book of his poetry, philosophical poetry. It's called De Rerum Natura, the nature of things. And in the book, he basically lays out, it's very similar. He was inspired by the Greek Epicurean philosopher, well, the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who said that what an image is, this is one of the earliest theory of the image as a material process that we have in the history of the West. And it's since been sort of transformed, and other ideas have had their heyday. But I do think there's something to return to. For me, the inspiration is his poetry. He calls them simulacra. And he says that everything in the world is sort of radiating out images, that they're sort of inside of objects. These images are sort of, bouncing off each other inside the object, and eventually they get to the exterior, and then they fly off the exterior of the object, and they collide in midair with other images. And this sounds, some people interpret this as being like, oh, it sounds like there's ghosts flying off of things, and that's just silly, and we don't need to think about that. But that's not what he says at all. And it's actually very close to modern physical understandings of what images are, which is, we're talking about light. That's light. If we're talking about photons, he did not use the language of photons. He used the language of simulacra. But that's essentially what it is, that they are bouncing off. Things inside of themselves are vibrating with photons. Photons are heat, photons are light. They're constantly vibrating, and they release all of these, waves of photons. And then the photons collide in midair. And look, for that reason, at every stage they're actually making something. They're producing, they're performing. There's no resemblance. Nothing looks like something. I mean, okay, there is something we call resemblance, but there's not any genuine copies. There's not any genuine originals. There's just these singular processes that kind of diffract, like if you dropped two pebbles into a pond and the ripples would hit each other and make a new pattern. At every stage, you're always looking at some specific pattern of the way that the photons interact with each other. So it's a very materialist way of thinking about what an image is, as opposed to the idealist way, which is, it's an idea that I have in my brain. And if that's what you think an image is, then only humans have them, and only humans can sort of talk about them, and they always will fail in representing the original image. There'll always be some poorly construed copy of what's out there. If you think about an image as a real, material, and singular process, then, it changes the way you think about what an image is, because what an image is what an image does. It doesn't represent anything. It moves, it does. So the question is, what are the patterns? And that's where I think the visual aspect makes a lot of sense. If you want to understand what images are, you need to have interactive and visual tools to map out what that image is doing.
And I believe that's applicable also to the digital world. I found it fascinating of how you're actually shifting perspective here. You name 3 features of mobile nature of the image, and I'd like to ask you about hybridity that you list as one of those defining features. You call it a pinnacle of fragmentation. I'm curious, what opportunities fragmentation opens?
That's the great, so I would say, when I say fragmentation, I don't necessarily mean like complete isolated fragments. The fragments that, there may be pieces, but they're like, they're little knots in a piece of string or something like that. They're always related and connected with other pieces, such that the pieces are never fully, cut off from one another. But the thing that's really great about, I think this is the way people have tended to think about digitality, as just fragmented bits and bytes, ones and zeros. but there are no ones and zeros that are fully fragmented and cut off. And that sounds opposite to the definition if we think about binarity and the digital age of ones and zeros. The truth is, if you just dig a little bit below that level of is a signal on or is a signal off, that's the basis of digital communication. If you just look below that level and look at the material structure of a transistor, it doesn't work like that. There is a constant flow of electrons and photons moving through that transistor. They do not always stop at the gate when the signal is supposed to be off. They jump the gate. It's a quantum effect called tunneling, which is where an electron's movement actually passes through the barrier. The smaller technology gets, the more fast, the faster it is, the more data we can store, the tinier those little gates get. And the tinier the gates get, the easier it is for the flows of electrons to pass through the gate. And then what happens is you get an error and your computer crashes. And these are happening more often now than they used to because of the technology. Half the time when your computer crashes and you think, why did it just crash? Why is my computer frozen? And I don't know why. There's a good chance that was because of the quantum effects of the material movement of electrons. So thinking about all of these pieces, it really draws your attention to the creativity and the agency of the matter itself that we're dealing with. It's not a question of, we try to represent things with ones and zeros, but what we often encounter is this very fascinating resistance of the matter itself, electricity, electrons, right, and photons. And that opens up a new possibility of working with that matter as opposed to trying to dominate it and trying to stick it into binary code. One interesting question for the digital age and the 21st century, where we've had digital communication for a while, is what new things might we discover? What new visual aspects, what new communication aspects, if we let the materiality, if you will, sort of play a role, speak in a way that we've tried to silence it or make it do our bidding? What might it say to us? How might we use it by working with it as opposed to trying to master it?
Absolutely. And I remember from your book that, when speaking about hybridity, you actually touched the digital foundation of the image, saying that anything that can be coded can be transcoded and then turn it into a hybrid of something else. So the beauty of transformation and allowing for new things to arise from something that pre-existed before actually opens a lot of new possibilities. The other defining feature of the digital image that you write about is the kinetic feedback. And the way I read it is that the matter interacts with itself to form a feedback loop. I kind of understand that when thinking of computer software operating greater degree and range of aesthetic transformation, but what about kinetic feedback when, let's say, we passively consume content by looking at a painting?
Yeah, so there's definitely, so these features of the digital image, one of the interesting things in the book that I sort of figured out just by researching some of the material structures, is that some of the features of the digital image, or really all three of them, are common to all the analog things too. There's not really this absolute division. If you think about, we often talk about digital culture and digital media. Oh, it's immaterial, it's in the cloud, it's virtual, but it's not. It's fully material. It has, the cloud is a huge building filled with hard drives, this vast internet infrastructure. It all has a material basis. And so in that sense, it's very much still analog. But in the same way, analog is very much still, it has still many of these features. It has aspects of hybridity. Collage is an instance where you can break things up and reassemble it. You have a kind of hybridity in analog things. But as just in your example of looking at a painting, there's a feedback that happens. And we don't often think about feedback. We think about feedback as being this noisy signal that's really kind of actually an annoying thing, possibly at the digital level. That's, a negative feedback loop that's kind of taking things where we don't want it to go. But that's partially what's interesting about both analog and digital feedback, is that it is taking us somewhere. There's a feedback that happens between two systems, in which both are sort of in control, but neither are in total control. And the result is something which is a genuinely unique, if you will, a kind of simulacral experience where the simulacral are meeting and they're diffracting and they're making something new. So when we think about looking at a painting, for instance, we often think about that as a passive reception of an external object. But the viewer is participating in that work of art just by being in that room, even if it were talking at a basic thermodynamic level of photons are radiating off your body as heat, and they are heating up at a very small level that painting. Light is reflecting off that painting and transforming it, degrading it. By looking at a painting with light, you are destroying that painting, okay, at a very small level. And over time, of course, it ends up totally destroying the painting. And that's why you have curation. And, I think curators are in a unique position to really see and feel and understand the materiality of works of art that a lot of museum goers don't, often think about. They feel like, oh, these are preserved works and they're kind of, they've got this eternal structure to them and they're being, but the preservation process is never permanent. It's ongoing. It has to constantly struggle against the effects of decay, of heat and light destruction of the painting. And so I think they realize that the painting is more of a feedback loop than you think that it is. You're
Right.
damaging. And it's also affecting you in ways that you're not fully aware of either. That its light is making, and its coloration is making you more sensitive to subtle differences in light and coloration. Even if you think that you're thinking about the symbolic meaning of such and such a man by a river or something like that, or Narcissus looking at himself in the pond, you're thinking about the symbolic representation of the painting. There is a material basis that is also working on you that you may not even be thinking about, but is affecting you. And it's the same way with digital culture, and the studies are now accumulating on that for sure. The Shallows, that book, and a number of other books that are trying to say, like, what is the internet doing to our brain? What is digital culture? How is it changing us? We're using it for symbolic and representational purposes, but there is this whole, again, below the surface, there's this vast iceberg of material consequences to the environment, to our bodies, to our brains, to undergo the performance and the feedback that we enter into when we look at a screen and use some kind of digital device.
When speaking of affecting and changing us by exposure to images, you see, I'm in the business of supporting understanding. You can call it a knowledge communication with the use of interactive whiteboards. And I kind of have like a front seat view on the feedback loops and transformation of the content. I see how those work as a key to unlock human understanding. So in the past, the knowledge or concepts were conveyed by text paragraphs and static slides. Now, those turn gradually into more visual forms, animation, ad hoc drawings, into whatever works. So the way I see it is that we're on the path of getting away from the rigid formal representations into a realm of smashing bits and pixels, so to say, to form new perspectives and gain new insights. I guess that's in the line of your thinking, I believe.
I think that's right. I think that communication has significantly changed such that it is absolutely much more about feedback. And with that feedback comes novelty. Feedback isn't always what you want it to be. And that's what's very interesting to me, is that when images and words and the material structure of how those are communicated through computers or through the internet or whatever, when you get all of those mixed together, when you get images with text, with digital speed, with a lot of social media and users, when you get all of that together, you are getting some serious feedback transformation in which all of those are kind of pulled out of their original contexts and make possible new ideas that aren't necessarily what we originally planned for them to be. But we also have to realize, and I think the feedback, even just having that, is like an explicitly interactive process. The interactivity makes us realize that we're performing, if that makes sense, like that we're doing something. We're not passively consuming. Even when we think we're passively consuming, you're actually generating something too. So I think it makes us really think deeply about the participatory nature that has always been the case with communication, visual or text based, that we're involved in it, and that makes us more responsible for making it, shaping it, and intentionally shaping it, and not just thinking that it's this fixed structure, we can't do anything. The mutability of communication is, yeah, maybe perhaps higher and more diverse and hybrid than it's ever been.
Absolutely. The way I see feedback is that we always thought of the feedback on a cognitive level of what worked, what triggered understanding. Was it a so-called picture superiority effect where visuals work better than words, or was it a spatial processing involved in understanding a concept, or visual metaphors? But I guess thanks to your insights, I see that it's possible to go deep, as you say, beyond sensations, to see the inner working of three distinctive features of the digital image that you list: this kinetic feedback, random motion, and hybridity. So I wonder, from your perspective, do you see technology as one directional enabler that gets us closer to the understanding of reality? Is it so?
Oh, that's such a great question because it's very tricky. On the one hand, I want to say it just depends on how you define digitality. But I do think, I think other most definitions are typical ones in which it's a binary structure. So let me give you two narratives that would say yes to that question. The first one is yes, the digital world is getting us closer to objective knowledge, and to more communication, more transparency, more accuracy. We can go, our pixels can get so close now, that they are, the term retina, is such a great term because that's the limit at which the eye can no longer distinguish the pixels. So what you could say on that front is, yes, we're definitely getting closer because look how small the pixels are now. Aren't we getting higher resolution and a better accuracy on the world? Okay, so that's one answer, and which, if that's the description, I disagree with that. I don't think that's why digitality is getting us any closer to reality or something like that.
All
So
right.
my answer would be yes. I do think that it actually is, but not in that way. So I think that digitality, and the digital age, it's the thing that's getting us, I suppose, closer to really thinking about reality in a different way, is that it's forcing us to realize something which had always been true about the nature of the image, whether analog or digital. The closer we get and the closer we drill down into that binary structure of ones and zeros, the more non-binary processes we start to discover. That's what's interesting about digitality, is not the digital 1, 2 itself, but the actual conclusion that if we push it far enough, we see it break down. And we see that below that is actually a continual fluctuation of quantum processes, which are not under our control and which reveal to us something that is novel about matter itself, something that's always been novel, but that we hadn't confronted it in that precise way. The history of art and the history of media is typically humans trying to control the world and make it look a certain way and do a certain something. There is a minor history to be said there, but for the most part, the Western history of media has been its use and technology is to control nature. But I think what's interesting to me about the digital age is that we've reached the limits of that control. And we realize and are forced to realize that it's an impossible project, and that what we really have been doing this whole time is not successful domination on this project to completely get an access to objective reality, but that we've been engaged in this kind of feedback loop, where the materiality of the media has shaped our bodies, our senses, our brains, just as much as we've been shaping the world through all of this media. And that's what I think the truth is, to be realized in the digital age, is not the superiority of the digital image, but precisely the what the digital images exposes to us explicitly, that older forms were there for sure, but that we hadn't quite realized. And so that's what I think we're sort of forced to confront that fact.
It's certainly getting our thinking less infantile, I would say, but do you see any risk that we might not be aware of on this path?
Yeah, for sure. The risk is that we will keep trying to find the ultimate way to bypass material processes and the performative act of interpretation. And what I mean there is just, if you think that you can break the world down into totally discrete bits and bytes, ones and zeros, that's the danger, because it will drive you absolutely mad trying to produce objective, clear, clean cut distinctions between ones and zeros, and not realize that there is this material process which will always thwart those efforts. The danger is definitely to use technology and media to try to control, and I mean essentially dominate meaning, and leave out interpretation. I mean, there are some philosophers who, really herald the digital age, and they imagine, oh, we'll just, we'll put jacks into our heads. I'll put one into the back of my head and you put one in the back of your head, and then we'll just communicate with binary code. And that way we'll bypass all of the messiness of language. I said this word and it meant something different to me than it did to you. And we have basically the messiness, which is in truth the beauty of poetry and literature. We can just get rid of all that and just have purely objective truth communicated with binary code. And I think that is the danger. That is absolutely the danger, is thinking that you can avoid the material performance of what we call interpretation, but is essentially performative collective feedback that is generating something new, not understanding some objective state of the world.
And before we close, what you see as a possible outcome of increasing software capacity in transforming digital images? Given the nature of digital image, what do you expect to happen in the near future?
Oh, I guess this depends how pessimistic or optimistic I am. I
Give us
think,
the best shot.
yeah, pessimistically, I would say, I'll give you both. What I expect when I'm feeling pessimistic is that we will continue with, for example, quantum computing to try to practically, even if we can't do it absolutely, we will practically try to keep pursuing the attempt to break the world down into ones and zeros, and to master the quantum flux and try to erase any errors, any noise, any fluctuations which we do not want to happen in of the electrical flow, like of electrons and photons flying through transistors, that we will keep on that path and try to continually break things down in the attempt for absolutely non-interpretive objective reality. And to think that we're getting any closer to that is, to me, absolutely the danger. And when I'm feeling pessimistic, that's what it feels like technology is going. Optimistically, I think that technologies that emphasize the and take seriously the materiality of the media that they're using, not just as a neutral media to facilitate communication, but as itself a creative thing, something that is changing the world, and to recognize the changes that it's having both in the environment, the material world, but the changes that it produces in us, in our bodies. And to take that seriously and ethically, to treat it more as a work of art, if you will. The sharing of images, the sharing of texts, it's not neutral communication, it's transformative, it's doing something to us. And I think that if you think about it as neutral communication that's objective, you're going to miss that ethical moment. So we really need to think about that ethical moment and be responsible for what we're doing to ourselves and doing to each other, and what we're creating. So taking ownership of that, essentially, and being, I suppose being serious and intentional about what that is
Yeah.
the optimistic outcome.
Yeah, and I join you on this optimistic end. Listen, Thomas, it was great pleasure to talk to you today. And it certainly helps me in my exploration of the verbal visual field of communication. But I also believe that your perspective is quite fresh to anyone that is trying to understand the direction that the technology is taking. So many thanks for sharing your insights with us today, and good luck shaking off humans' immaturity of perception.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.